The truck came in before the mist burned off, the way it always had. Every Tuesday and every Friday, when the light lay low and gold across the pasture and the fence posts were still dripping, a box truck backed up to the far corner of Nell Prather's field and tipped its load over the rail. Wet coffee grounds, black and heavy, steaming faintly in the cold air, and riding on top of them, light as ash, a drift of pale papery flakes that lifted in the smallest breeze and came down in the grass like snow that never melted. The man who drove it was Cy Odegaard, a heavy-set roastery hand in a chaff-dusted apron and steel-toed boots. He never once called the load anything but garbage. "9 bucks making more of this than we can get rid of," he said that first morning, thumbing his cap back. "The landfill charges us by the ton. The compost yard won't take it wet. Your field corner is on my way home. You mind?" Nell Prather did not mind. She was a rangy woman in a soot-cuffed canvas work jacket with a gray braid pinned under a knit cap, and by then she had stopped minding most of what the world handed her. The welding and repair shop she had run with her husband Ward sat cold at the end of the lane, the compressor unplugged, his gloves still curled on the bench where he set them down. 2 winters gone now. The equipment loan had outlived him. The bank called on the 1st of the month, and sometimes again on the 15th. When a man offers you something for nothing, even garbage, you take it and you say thank you. So the heap grew. It grew through a wet spring and a hot stretch of summer and into the gray end of the year, a black slumped mound taller than the fence rails, and it did not behave like anything she had piled up before. Wet grounds packed tight. Air cannot get into them. What sits in the middle sours instead of rotting clean, and by July that heap gave off a smell like vinegar and burnt sugar, and something turning in a jar, a smell that rode downhill on the evening air and got into the laundry on the line. Flies found it in numbers she had not known existed, and hung over the corner of the field in a low gray haze you could hear from the porch, and the chaff went everywhere. That was the part that made enemies. The pale flakes were nearly weightless, and every gust off the ridge lifted a sheet of them off the pile and carried them across the road into other people's gardens, screened porches, clean trucks. Somebody at the feed store started calling her corner the coffee bog. Somebody else improved on it and called the whole place Prather's ashtray, and that one stuck, and it came back to her the way those things always do, secondhand and grinning. She let the heap grow anyway. Part of it was plain arithmetic. She had no money to haul it off and no standing to tell Cy Odegaard to quit bringing it. But part of it was harder to say out loud. Nell had spent 2 winters under that soft, sorry look people save for a widow with a shut-down shop and a note she cannot cover, and somewhere in there she had quit caring what the corner of her field looked like from the road. They had written her off. Fine, let them write off the heap too. It cost her nothing to be the joke, and a great deal to pretend she was not one. The morning it turned was a cold one, and it turned for the smallest imaginable cause. She was out of newspaper. The wood stove in the kitchen was her only heat. There was propane in the tank and no money to fill it again, so the stove ran on scrap oak from the shop and whatever she could find to start it, and that morning she had burned the last of the paper, and the kindling box held nothing but bark dust. She walked out to the fence with a bucket for a handful of the dry stuff off the top of the pile, just to have something with volume to it. The wind had drifted the chaff into a crust across the crown of the heap, bone dry, crisp as a wasp nest, so light that the whole bucketful weighed less than a quart of water. She twisted a fistful into a loose nest, laid it under the split oak, and touched a match to it. It did not catch. It went up. The chaff took the flame the way a dry curtain takes it, all at once and everywhere. A fast, bright roar that filled the firebox in under 3 heartbeats, and had the oak lit before she could get the door shut. She stood there with the match burning down toward her fingers and looked at that fire and did not move for a long moment. Something everybody agreed was garbage had just done a job better than anything she had ever paid for. Verna Kroll came out to look at it 2 days later, because Verna Kroll came out to look at anything involving fire. She was a wiry retired fire crew volunteer with a silver crew cut and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she had spent 30-odd winters learning exactly what burns and why. She took a pinch of the chaff, rolled it between her fingers, held it up to the light, and started to laugh. "That's silver skin," Verna said. "It's the husk off the bean. It comes loose in the roaster, and they blow it into a bin and they cannot give it away. Look at it. It's dry, it has no oil in it to smoke, and it has about the most surface area per ounce of anything in nature. That is not trash. That is the finest kindling I have ever had in my hand, and there's a mountain of it out there rotting under your rain." Then Verna walked over and put her boot into the black part of the heap, and her face changed. "Now this," she said, "is a different animal entirely. Spent grounds still carry oil. Brewing takes the flavor out of them, but it does not take the fuel out. Pound for pound, dried, that stuff runs hotter than a lot of hardwood, and it burns slow because it's dense. Trouble is, it's better than half water the day it comes off that truck. Wet coffee doesn't burn. Wet coffee just makes steam and grief. Dry it, though, dry it, and squeeze it, and you have got something." Nell went to bed that night and did not sleep. She had one clear picture in her head and could not put it down. A fire log. A dense, hand-length, pressed log made out of a substance that a roastery 2 towns over paid money to get rid of. The trouble was that the grounds would not hold together. She dried a batch on window screens laid over sawhorses in the barn, turning it by hand twice a day for a week until it was loose and dark and dusty as spent tea. Then she packed it into a coffee can with the ends cut out, put a board on top, and stood on it. She got a puck. It looked wonderful for about 4 heartbeats and then broke in her hands, and what fell on the floor was not a broken log. It was a pile of dust. She tried again with more pressure. Same dust. She tried damp, and the damp one held its shape until it dried, then cracked into 4 pieces and crumbled at the edges when she lifted one out. She lost the better part of a month that way. She tried flour paste, which worked and also cost more than the fuel was worth and stank when it burned. She tried soaked cardboard pulp, which bound the puck beautifully and turned it into a sullen, smoldering brick that put out almost no heat. She tried wax from a box of candle ends, and it bound and it made the logs greasy and dripped in the firebox. Every failure was honest and every failure was expensive in time, and there were evenings she sat on an overturned bucket with dust to her elbows and thought about paying somebody to take the whole heap away. What finally showed her the answer was a mistake. She had a screen tray of dried grounds sitting in the aisle of the barn with the doors open, and the wind came up the valley and blew a haze of chaff off the pile and into the tray. She was annoyed. She nearly dumped it. Instead, she pressed it, because it was already mixed and she had nothing to lose, and the puck that came out of the can did not break. She thumbed the edge. It held. She dropped it on the concrete from waist height, and it bounced and stayed whole. The chaff was the binder. That was the whole thing, and she could hardly believe how long it had been sitting in plain view. The papery husk is fiber, thousands of tiny flat flakes with teeth on them, and under pressure it knits through the dust the way straw knits through mud brick, catching, overlapping, holding the whole mass in a web while the natural oil in the grounds does the rest. She did not need flour or wax or cardboard. She did not need to buy one single thing. The two halves of that heap, the sour black part everybody could smell and the flyaway pale part everybody complained about, had been delivered to her fence together in roughly the right proportion for years. Nobody had ever thought to pull them apart and then put them back together on purpose. The heap had been carrying its own answer the entire time. After that, it was engineering, and engineering was the one thing she had never lost. Ward's shop still had a 12-ton bottle jack, a chop saw, a stick welder, and a rack of scrap steel under a tarp out back. She cleared the bench for the first time in 2 winters. She cut a length of 6-inch pipe for a die, welded a flange to the bottom, built a frame out of square tube, and set the jackhead down into it. She turned a follower plate to fit the bore with a hair of clearance so water and air could escape past it under load, because the first 3 dies had no relief at all and simply locked up and blew the mix out around the plate like toothpaste. The 4th one worked. She filled the die, pumped the jack until the frame groaned, held the pressure for a slow count of 60, and backed it off. What she knocked out onto the bench was a hand-length black cylinder, banded with faint pale threads of chaff, dense as a bar of soap and smelling faintly and unmistakably of a coffee shop. The first burn was a disaster. She was too eager. She built a fire in the kitchen stove that evening with 3 of them and a nest of chaff, and it lit fine and then filled the house with a thick gray smoke that stung the eyes and left a sticky film on the stove glass in under an hour. Smoke rolled out of her chimney in a dirty column you could see from the road. The man who farmed across the way drove over the next morning to make sure nothing was on fire, and he was polite about it, and that was somehow worse. Verna came and looked at the logs and looked at the stove glass and gave her the news straight. Water, she said. You pressed them and you were proud of them and you burned them the same week. There is still water in the middle of that log, and there is oil that never got a chance to set. Water in your fuel means a cold fire, and a cold fire smokes every time, no matter what you feed it. You did not build a bad log, you built a wet one. So Nell built drying racks. She made 8 of them out of scrap tube and hardware cloth, filled the loft of the barn with them, and ran a slow fan at one end to keep air moving down the aisle. A pressed log went onto a rack, and it stayed there. 4 weeks minimum, 6 in damp weather. She wrote the press date on the end of every log with a paint pen and never let herself touch a rack early, not once. She lengthened the press cycle too, holding pressure a full 3 minutes, so the jack squeezed the free water out through the relief before the log came off the bench. The next burn was a different thing entirely. A cured log went into a bed of chaff and caught in under a minute. It burned with a low, even orange flame and almost no visible smoke, and it held that flame better than 2 hours without needing a thing from her, and left a fine pale ash and a firebox with clean glass. She sat on the kitchen floor in front of the stove with her arms around her knees and watched the last of it go, and stayed there until the coals went gray. The fire starters came out of that same week. She was not going to waste the finest kindling in the county on her own stove alone. She packed loose chaff into paper egg flats, wet each cup with a spoonful of melted candle ends, and let them set into brittle little nests that would take a match in a wind and burn steady for 8 minutes. 12 to a flat, snapped apart like squares off a chocolate bar. They cost her the paper and the wax and nothing else. And there was still a third of that heap she could not use for fuel. The finest dust that fell through the screens, the wet clump stuff at the bottom, the sweepings off the slab. She blended it with a measure of chaff for air and turned it in long windrows behind the barn until the sourness cooked out and it came up dark and crumbly and smelling like clean dirt after rain. Bagged in 50-pound sacks, it made a soil amendment the market growers in the valley took one look at and started buying by the pallet. Nothing off that truck went to waste anymore. Not one shovelful. The first thing she ever sold, she sold off a card table at a farm stand out on the county road. 20 logs and 30 starter nests stacked in a crate with a hand-lettered sign. She sat behind that table all morning feeling like a fool. A woman bought 2 logs to be polite. She came back the next Saturday and bought 20 and told everybody at the stand exactly what they did. The hardware store was the turn. The owner of the place in town had a woodstove display in his front window and a bin of overpriced starter blocks beside it that had not moved all year. Nell walked in with 3 cured logs in a feed sack, and he let her light one in the display stove, and the 2 of them stood there and watched it. He watched the smoke, or the lack of it. He watched the clock. 40 minutes in, he asked what she could deliver in a month and whether she could band them in paper so they would stack neat on a shelf. She could. She got a die cutter and a roll of craft paper and banded them by hand at the kitchen table, 400 at a stretch. Word moved slowly and then all at once, the way it does in a small place. The stove shop out on the highway took a pallet. 2 more hardware stores called. The farm stands wanted the starter flats by the register in the cold months and the sacked soil amendment out front in the spring. She kept the orders in a spiral notebook on the corner of the kitchen table, and the line pages filled with store names and pallet counts and delivery dates until the evening she sat down with a cup of coffee, turned back through the book, and understood that she had promised out more than her one press could make. Cy Odegaard came out that autumn to back the truck up to the fence, and Nell walked out to meet him with a paper in her hand. She wanted the load separated. Chaff in its own bin, grounds in another, both under cover. Both delivered within 4 days of roasting instead of whenever he got around to it. In exchange, she would take every ounce 9-bark made, on a schedule, in writing, and they could stop paying the landfill by the ton forever. Cy read it twice, standing there, a heavy-set roastery hand in a chaff-dusted apron and steel-toed boots, and then he laughed out loud and went to the truck for a pen. 2 roasteries in the next county heard about it inside a year. Both of them called her. Both of them offered to pay her to haul their waste away, which meant the raw material that had made her the joke of the county road was now a line of income before she had pressed a single log out of it. She built a second press that winter and a third the spring after, and she took on 2 hands to run them. The corner of the field where the heap used to sit is graded gravel now, with a roofed bay for the chaff and a covered slab for the grounds, and Prather's ashtray is a name you still hear at the feed store, except now the people saying it are the ones telling somebody where to go to buy fire logs by the pallet. On a cold morning, it still steams out there, the way it always has. When the light lies low and gold across the pasture and the mist hangs in the bottom of the field. A rangy woman in a soot-cuffed canvas work jacket with a gray braid pinned under a knit cap walks the fence line with a mug in her hand and looks at the heap everybody told her was worthless, and she is the only one who ever thought to ask what was actually in it.